Rome, 69 BCE. The forum echoes with a sound more devastating than any battle cry laughter. Not the jovial laughter of triumph, but the sharp, cutting mockery that slices through a man's reputation like a gladius through flesh. The target, Julius Caesar himself. The wound, 3 words: Queen of Bithynia. What secret from Caesar's youth possessed such power that his enemies would wield it for decades, long after he had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and reshaped the very foundations of Rome? Why would this particular scandal, whispered in Senate chambers, sung in soldiers' camps, recorded by historians, prove more unkillable than Caesar himself? History remembers what it chooses to forget, and sometimes what we attempt to bury speaks loudest of all. To understand the scandal that would haunt Julius Caesar until his dying day and beyond, we must first transport ourselves to a Mediterranean world vastly different from our own, yet disturbingly familiar in its politics of power and perception. This is the late Roman Republic, roughly 80 BCE, a civilization at the height of its dominance, yet teetering on the precipice of transformation. The medieval history enthusiasts might draw parallels to later European courts, but Rome's particular blend of military machismo and political theater created a unique crucible for reputation. The Roman Republic of Caesar's youth was an entity built on conquest, sustained by image, and governed by an almost obsessive concern with dignitas, a concept far deeper than mere dignity. Dignitas encompassed a man's honor, his standing, his very essence as a Roman citizen and, particularly for the elite, as a potential leader. To possess dignitas was to command respect. To lose it was to cease to matter. Young Gaius Julius Caesar, born in 100 BCE into a patrician family of modest means but ancient lineage, stood at 20 as a man of considerable promise but uncertain future. Tall for a Roman, approximately 5 feet 7 inches, with dark, penetrating eyes and a lean frame that would later thicken with military campaigns, Caesar possessed that indefinable quality contemporaries called gratia, charm, charisma, magnetic presence. His family claimed descent from Venus herself, through Aeneas, the Trojan hero. Grand heritage, yes. Current influence, considerably less impressive. The year was 80 BCE. Rome was emerging from the blood-soaked chaos of Sulla's dictatorship, a period when prescription lists meant death, when fortunes vanished overnight, when the streets ran red with the blood of citizens murdered for their wealth or their politics. Caesar, connected by marriage to Sulla's rival Marius, found himself in a precarious position. He needed to leave Rome. He needed military credentials. He needed, quite frankly, to survive. Enter Bithynia. This ancient kingdom, nestled along the southern coast of the Black Sea in what is now northwestern Turkey, occupied a strategically vital position in Rome's eastern ambitions. Rich in timber, minerals, and agricultural wealth, Bithynia served as a buffer state between Roman territory and the various kingdoms and empires of Asia Minor. Its king, Nicomedes IV, ruled a realm of approximately 6,000 square miles territory, smaller than the state of New Jersey, but far more politically significant. Nicomedes himself remains a figure obscured by historical distance and Roman bias, yet certain facts emerge from the mists. He ascended to the throne around 94 BCE, following the complex and often violent succession practices of Hellenistic kingdoms. Educated in the Greek tradition, philosophy, rhetoric, arts, he governed a realm where Greek culture overlaid ancient Anatolian traditions, creating a sophisticated, if somewhat decadent, court culture that Romans both admired and disdained. He was older than Caesar by perhaps 25 years, placing him in his mid-40s during the events in question. For Romans, who often viewed Eastern kings as simultaneously wealthy and weak, sophisticated and corrupt, Nicomedes embodied every stereotype. The mission was straightforward enough. Young military tribune Caesar, attached to the staff of Marcus Minucius Thermus, the governor of Asia, received orders to travel to Bithynia's capital, Nicomedia, present-day Izmit in Turkey. His task: secure naval support from King Nicomedes for Rome's siege of Mytilene, a rebel city on the island of Lesbos. A diplomatic errand, essentially. A routine assignment for an ambitious young officer seeking to build his military credentials. Caesar departed. Spring, 80 BCE. The journey from Roman Asia to Nicomedia would have taken several days by road, traversing the ancient King's Road through pine-forested mountains, past Greek colonies where the scent of olive oil mixed with salt air, through valleys where farmers still worked, land their ancestors had tended for millennia. What thoughts occupied Caesar's mind during that journey? Anticipation of diplomatic success? Anxiety about his first major independent mission? Or merely the practical concerns of a young officer trying to make his mark? He arrived at the court of Nicomedes, and something happened. What precisely occurred in those palace halls remains lost to history, deliberately obscured, perhaps, or simply unrecorded in detail. But Caesar stayed. He stayed longer than his mission required. He stayed, according to later accounts, 40 days, nearly 6 weeks. The ships he was sent to requisition eventually provided, but the young Roman tribune seemed in no particular hurry to depart. The palace at Nicomedia, archaeological evidence suggests, was a masterwork of Hellenistic architecture: marble colonnades, intricate mosaics, gardens fragrant with imported flowers, chambers cooled by underground springs. Here, Greek philosophy mingled with Persian luxury, Roman pragmatism with Eastern ceremony. Dinner parties, the famous Greek symposia, lasted deep into the night, fueled by wine from Cyprus, entertainment from across the Mediterranean, conversation that ranged from politics to poetry. This was a world of refinement that rough Roman military camps could scarcely imagine. Did Caesar simply enjoy the luxury, the intellectual stimulation, the attention of a powerful patron? Or was there, as the rumors would insist, something more intimate? The scandal exploded, not immediately, but slowly, like a wine stain spreading across silk. First came the whispers among Roman officers. Caesar returned to Thermus's headquarters with the promised fleet, but also with questions trailing him like shadows. Why had he stayed so long? Why did Nicomedes grant him such unusual access? And why this detail would prove particularly damaging did Caesar later return to Bithynia, claiming some business matter required his attention. Then came the songs. Roman military culture included a tradition of versus militaris, soldier songs, often crude, always honest, sometimes brutal in their mockery. During Caesar's later triumphs, even as he rode through Rome in glory, his own soldiers sang. Caesar laid the Gauls low. Nicomedes laid Caesar low. The sexual innuendo was unambiguous. The public humiliation, profound. But it was Caesar's political enemies who truly weaponized the scandal. History facts often hinge on such personal attacks, revealing as much about the accusers as the accused. Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, the name itself now survives primarily as Caesar's rival struck first and hardest. During their joint consulship in 59 BCE, nearly 2 decades after the alleged affair, Bibulus coined the phrase that would echo through centuries: Regina Bithyniae, the Queen of Bithynia. In Rome's aggressively masculine political culture, where even effeminacy in dress could destroy a career, such an accusation carried nuclear weight. Bibulus didn't merely suggest Caesar had engaged in a same-sex relationship. He implied Caesar had assumed the passive role, the female position. In Roman thinking, this wasn't just a sexual matter, it was a fundamental betrayal of what it meant to be a Roman man. The accusations spread like fire through dry timber. Political graffiti appeared on walls throughout Rome. Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, perhaps Rome's greatest orator, a man whose words could topple careers, mentioned the scandal in court proceedings. In 59 BCE, during a Senate debate, Cicero remarked with calculated cruelty on Caesar's loss of virginity to the king while lying on a golden couch. The specificity of the detail, the golden couch, suggested either inside knowledge or inventive propaganda. Either way, the damage was done. Dolabella, another senatorial voice, referred to Caesar in legal proceedings as the queen's rival and the inner partner of the royal bed. Gaius Scribonius Curio the Elder, speaking in the Senate, called Caesar every woman's man and every man's woman. The attacks weren't subtle, they weren't meant to be. Even Caesar's own soldiers, despite their fierce loyalty in battle, couldn't resist the joke. During his Gallic triumph in 46 BCE, one of the proudest moments of his life, his veterans sang not just of his military prowess, but also of his alleged youthful indiscretion. The song survived in the historical record precisely because the historian Suetonius, writing about 150 years later, found it too significant to omit. Think about that. A century and a half after Caesar's death, the scandal remained vivid enough to merit inclusion in the official biography. The pattern of evidence creates what historians call persistent testimony, when multiple independent sources, spanning decades, reference the same event. We have Cicero's writings, Suetonius's biography, Cassius Dio's history, written centuries later but drawing on sources now lost. None provide definitive proof. All indicate something occurred that Caesar's enemies found exploitable, and Caesar himself found impossible to completely refute. Caesar's response? Denial, certainly. Suetonius records that Caesar gave the lie to this scandal, and later supported his denial with testimony from certain Roman nobles. But he also notes, and here the psychology becomes fascinating, that Caesar continued to maintain friendly relations with Bithynia, and later, as a military commander, showed particular attention to Eastern affairs. Was this evidence of lingering affection, strategic necessity, or simply Caesar's characteristic refusal to be intimidated by gossip? Archaeological discoveries in recent decades add texture, if not certainty, to our understanding. Excavations at the site of ancient Nicomedes, though complicated by modern urban development, have revealed a palace complex of considerable sophistication. Numismatic evidence coins from Nicomedes' reign show a king who embraced both Greek cultural identity and Roman political alignment, a delicate balancing act that required considerable diplomatic skill. The portrait on these coins shows a man with refined features, carefully groomed beard, and the diadem of Hellenistic kingship. This was no barbarian warlord, but a cultured monarch navigating dangerous times. Contemporary papyri from Egypt, which preserved countless documents from the period, reference diplomatic exchanges between Rome and Bithynia during this period, confirming the active relationship between the powers. While these documents don't mention Caesar or any scandal, they establish the historical context. Young Roman officers regularly visited Eastern courts, mixing military necessity with diplomatic cultivation of relationships. Here's what we know with historical certainty. Julius Caesar visited Bithynia in 80 BCE. He stayed longer than strictly necessary. He returned later, briefly. His enemies used this to attack him for decades. The scandal survived his lifetime and echoed through Roman literature for centuries afterward. Medieval history scholars studying later European courts find curious parallels how personal scandals, especially those involving sexuality and power, become weapons of political warfare across cultures and centuries. Here's what we cannot know: the truth of what happened in that palace. Did Caesar and Nicomedes engage in a romantic or sexual relationship? Was Caesar, as some historians speculate, simply cultivating a powerful patron through means common in Eastern Mediterranean courts, but scandalous to Roman sensibilities? Was the entire story fabricated by political enemies, built on nothing more than Caesar's extended stay and their own propaganda needs? The historian's honest answer is frustrating. We will never know. The evidence is circumstantial, partisan, and separated from the events by years or decades. Every source has an agenda. Every account serves a purpose beyond simple truth-telling. But perhaps that uncertainty itself teaches us something profound. Consider what the scandal reveals about Roman culture. In a society that celebrated military conquest, that built an empire on disciplined force, that prided itself on virtus, literally manliness, the worst accusation against a man wasn't that he was cruel or greedy, or even incompetent. It was that he had violated the sexual norms that defined Roman masculine identity. Caesar could cross the Rubicon, dissolve the Republic, declare himself dictator. All of this could be forgiven, understood, even admired by some. But the whisper that he had once been queen of Bithynia, that stain never washed away. This tells us that Rome, for all its military might and legal sophistication, was a culture profoundly anxious about masculinity, about power, about the boundaries between conquest and submission. The scandal reveals not Caesar's alleged actions but Rome's deepest insecurities. Consider, too, what the scandal reveals about political combat across history. The attacks on Caesar weren't substantively about sexuality at all, they were about power. Bibulus didn't actually care what had happened in Bithynia 40 years earlier. Cicero didn't base his political opposition on Caesar's youthful indiscretions. But both recognized that in the court of public opinion, personal scandal could achieve what policy arguments could not: the destruction of a rival's credibility and dignitas. This pattern, using personal attacks to avoid engaging with policy positions, should sound depressingly familiar to anyone who observes contemporary politics. The tactics change less than we imagine. Only the technology of their delivery evolves. And finally, consider what Caesar's response reveals about human resilience. Despite the scandal, despite decades of mockery, despite seeing his own soldiers sing jokes about his alleged affair during his moment of triumph, Caesar became arguably the most significant figure in Roman history. He conquered Gaul, modern France, Belgium, parts of Germany and Switzerland. He authored literary works still studied today. He fundamentally altered the structure of Roman government. His name became a title, Kaiser, Tsar, that rulers claimed for 2 millennia. The Queen of Bithynia became the builder of an empire. What does this tell us? Perhaps that resilience matters more than reputation. Perhaps that accusations, no matter how damaging, need not define a life. Perhaps that history judges us ultimately not by the gossip of our youth, but by the substance of our achievements. Or perhaps it tells us something more ambiguous, that power, once achieved, can overwhelm scandal, that success doesn't erase stains but makes them irrelevant, that Caesar survived his scandal not by clearing his name, but by making his name too significant to be destroyed by it. The truth about Julius Caesar and Nicomedes IV remains lost to history, deliberately obscured or accidentally forgotten, buried under 2,000 years of political propaganda and historical reinterpretation. What survives is not certainty, but testament to scandal's enduring power. How a whispered rumor from 80 BCE still echoes in our historical consciousness, still provokes debate, still demonstrates that the line between public image and private truth remains humanity's eternal battlefield. In the end, the scandal matters less for what it reveals about Caesar's past than for what it illuminates about history's nature. We inherit not objective truth, but curated memory stories selected, emphasized, or suppressed by those with the power to write them down. The Queen of Bithynia legend survived because Romans found it useful, because historians found it compelling, because we find it irresistible. Every generation rewrites history in its own image, seeking in the past reflections of present concerns. Romans used Caesar's alleged affair to debate masculinity and Eastern influence. Medieval scholars might have seen in it lessons about the corruption of power. We see questions of sexuality, identity, and the weaponization of personal lives. Caesar lies buried beneath Rome, murdered on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Nicomedes rests somewhere in ancient Bithynia, his kingdom eventually absorbed into the Roman Empire he had courted. Their alleged romance, real or fabricated, outlived them both. And perhaps that's the final lesson. We control neither the stories told about us, nor the meaning assigned to them by future ages. We can only live with such integrity that the truth, whatever it was, would not shame us if revealed. The scandal of Bithynia reminds us that history is never simply about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, how we choose to interpret, and why those choices matter. The past isn't dead, it isn't even past. It lives in every whispered accusation, every political attack, every time we weaponize personal scandal instead of engaging with substantive debate. Julius Caesar walked through the palace gardens of Nicomedia 21 centuries ago. What occurred there remains unknowable, but the echoes those survive. And in those echoes, if we listen carefully, we hear not just ancient Roman gossip, but eternal human truths about power, reputation, and the stories we tell to destroy or defend, to remember or forget. The Queen of Bithynia scandal isn't history. It's a mirror, and what we see reflected depends on what we bring to the viewing. In the ruins of Nicomedia, scattered stones mark where a palace once stood. Tourists walk past rarely, guidebooks mention briefly. But somewhere in those fragments of marble and memory, a 20-year-old Roman officer once made choices that would echo through millennia, choices we'll never fully understand, in a world we can barely imagine, creating a scandal that outlived an empire. That persistent scandal, surviving when civilization falls, that's the true story. Not what happened, but that we're still asking, still wondering, still trying to solve mysteries that perhaps were never meant to be solved, only endured.